Welcome. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, and this is the latest of our Danube Dialogues podcasts. My guest today is Marion Smith. Welcome, Marion. Marion is the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And we're going to talk about the way in which we commemorate, or unfortunately very often fail to commemorate, the victims of communism in our societies across the Western world. My first question is that your organization is in fact called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. That casts a light back to the past, which is indeed worth looking at because, of course, in the case of communism, it's a past of crimes, almost unparalleled in human history, amounting to, by one estimate, 100 million victims. At the same time, communism at the moment is enjoying something of an upsurge in popularity in the Western world, and particularly in the United States, and particularly apparently among young and well-educated people. So my first question is to examine this extraordinary paradox, that the history of communism, which we know about, is a history of terror, genocide, murder, and oppression. But the popularity of communism is about not paying student loans, having free health care, generally enjoying the good things of life paid for at someone's expense. That's perhaps an unfair picture, but nonetheless, it's a broad truth about the way in which we talk about or don't talk about communism today. Would you like to try to solve that conundrum?
Sure, and John, it's always wonderful to be with you and always great to be in Budapest. I think you're right. There is a gross misunderstanding of the intellectual and historical meaning of Marxism, socialism, communism. And I think this is because there was a failure to have a moral or legal accountability for the crimes of communist regimes following the collapse of communism in Europe in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But of course, we have to remember that communism lived on in China and elsewhere. But in terms of education, in the last few decades, there has also been a failure to educate about basic lessons of the 20th century as regards this history. And there absolutely is a double standard in terms of how we treat the crimes of Nazism and fascism and how we treat the crimes of communism.
Would you like to estimate, I mentioned 100 million people were victims of communism, but what's interesting, of course, is the degree to which they're found all over the communist regimes, and communist crimes are really found in every part of the world.
You're right. The Black Book of Communism, published a couple decades ago, was the first major attempt to put a number, nation by nation, to those who were killed by communist regimes. And that estimate, yes, is putting it roughly at the number of 100 million. And of course, it is impossible to get an exact accounting, not least because in countries of Russia and China, there is no effort to have an accounting of the crimes, to identify the victims, and in some cases, an effort to erase the history and eliminate the memory of those victims. This is true in terms of Russia, sort of falsification of Gulag archives and some of the files of the KGB. In the case of China, it's true in attempts to threaten or imprison survivors of the Tiananmen Square massacre. So I think it's difficult to arrive at an exact accounting, but there certainly are scientific ways of addressing the question and getting at a ballpark figure, and it is absolutely in the tens of millions. And in China alone, 50 million in the 20th century. In Russia, 20 to 30. And in the some 40 nations that experienced communist rule, they all had in common that a significant portion of the population was killed as a matter of policy in peacetime by the government. And that in a forensic way has not been dealt with in the way that other genocides have been or the Holocaust has been. And so there's a lot of work to do.
Is it not the case that in addition to the upsurge of support for communism and or socialism among American students and professors, that there's another reason why we can't consign communism, so to speak, to memorials and to history books, and that is that communism hasn't actually gone away. It didn't end in 1989 and 1991. It's still an aggressive and powerful force in today's world.
That's right. I think that both intellectually and materially, Marxism represents the greatest threat to our way of life. Intellectually, to the Enlightenment values of liberalism, human dignity, human rights, free enterprise, representative democracy. And then materially, of course, North Korea, China, Cuba. These countries represent some of the most significant national security threats to free people, both here in Europe and in the United States. And I think that our elites have been disingenuous in how they've treated the importance of understanding communism in the world. We certainly wouldn't try to understand the United States or our political culture or our strategic culture without taking very seriously the ideas of democracy and all of those principles that guide and govern our discourse. So to try to take seriously a treatment of China or Russia without understanding the role of communism, the importance of Marxist ideology in framing the debate and their claims of justifying their leadership, is to miss the point, and I think to disadvantage ourselves in confronting the intellectual and the material threats that face us today. Xi Jinping, for his part, has been very clear that he's studied the Cold War. He's studied glasnost and perestroika. He has studied the successes and the failures of Western policy in containing the Soviet Union. And he has no intention of making some of the mistakes that the Soviet Union made. And if only Western analysts and lawmakers were as serious in learning from the 20th century as some of our opponents are.
You yourself were educated in American schools and universities at a time when the ideas that you've just been criticizing were beginning to be put about, beginning to be common, general, or in the Ivy League colleges, I would say more or less universal. People who opposed those ideas were the people who stood out and had little influence and increasingly were simply excluded. So I would like to ask a little bit about how you came by your ideas in this environment and how you came, your background generally, but how you came to be the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation.
I was homeschooled for most of my young life.
And then I studied in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, New York, and here in Hungary, and France. And I think within that, I've always been a student of history. I've enjoyed reading history. But when I was in, especially New York and Europe, I recognized that they had a very different understanding of the 20th century than I had growing up in South Carolina. And my family has been in South Carolina since before the Revolution, and I think it was astonishing to me at a young age to realize that the rest of the world didn't have that historical experience. I recognized during my time in Western Europe that there was absolutely a fascination with Marxism, a trivialization of the crimes of Marxist regimes, and a tendency to call anyone who wanted to talk about it fascist. And this of course is not an accurate understanding of 20th century history. And I then, for many years, worked on understanding early U.S. foreign policy. So I had a research project while I was at the Heritage Foundation, trying to understand early U.S. statecraft, diplomacy, military affairs. And that led me to meet some of the trustees of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. My time here in Hungary and in Central and Eastern Europe helped me to understand how raw the history is, how much history can be weaponized by countries like Putin's Russia or China, and so how important it is to defend an accurate understanding of history and to finally have some justice for the victims of communist regimes, and certainly I think in the last few years to, as a matter of foreign policy and national security, prevent single-party communist dictatorships from expanding their territory and their influence, and also stopping them from undermining the freedoms that we enjoy in the United States of America. I'm sure you are aware that there are many examples of Russia, China, Cuba especially, intimidating American citizens, infiltrating universities, trying to squelch academic freedom in addressing issues of Chinese, Cuban, or Russian history. And so, these things are not only a national security matter, but, core to what it means to live free in the United States.
You mentioned that you studied here in Hungary, and in fact you are married to a distinguished Hungarian, a former diplomat.
Indeed.
And you live part of the year in this country. And I'd like to ask about the influence that this may have had on you, because not long before he died, the great anti-communist dissident Vladimir Bukovsky was expressing sadness at the fact that all the work the dissidents had done seemed to have been very moderate in its success. But he did say this. He said, we didn't succeed in Soviet Union and so on, but in Eastern and Central Europe, yes, there we made a real difference. I think that's right. Do you think that difference is lasting?
Well, you mean in terms of some sort of accountability for the legacy of communism?
Some sort of accountability, some sort of understanding in the mass of people that communism is quite different to any other political choice.
Yes.
For a start, it's one from which you can almost never go back without the collapse of the system or without actually fighting it. And so I think Bukovsky, this was his comfort as he was dying, that yes, Hungary, Poland, the former Czechoslovakia, they were, in a sense, safely free, safely anti-communist. But of course, we've thought that about other countries in the past, and we now see, of course, that communism is really quite hard to eradicate completely from the minds of people and from the sympathy they have.
Well, I mean, I think here in Hungary, it's demonstrated historically, if it's the Bela Kun regime 100 years ago or the Soviet invasion, occupation following World War II, I think Hungarians and others in Central and Eastern Europe, due to the history, certainly understand that socialist and communist will seek to win either by participating in the democratic process or usurping the democratic process, but in any event, they mean to supplant the democratic process and institute a Marxist society, which is a denial of individual liberty and religious freedom, free speech, civil society, all the things that we hold sacred in our Western tradition of politics. And so, yes, I think communism following World War II in Central and Eastern Europe obviously was not a choice for these countries. It was imposed by Stalin's Soviet forces. Puppet governments were set up in violation of promises made at Yalta. And in Western Europe, you had a zone of American protection following World War II, where I think that there was no need to deal in a fundamental way with communism, and it also allowed them to engage in a welfare state system that was not, as we now find out, ultimately sustainable. And I do think that Western Europeans don't quite understand the importance of the past here in Central and Eastern Europe. I think that when either Viktor Orban or the Law and Justice Party in Poland or other political parties in Central and Eastern Europe in the last few years, when they talk about finishing the regime change in these countries, I think to American and Western European ears, this sounds odd. That was done more than 30 years ago. What are you talking about? But when I was in Poland a few weeks ago, it was astonishing to me that the main political prison, right in the heart of Warsaw, used by the secret police to book and interrogate political prisoners, it continued as a working prison following the regime change until 2016. And it's been only very recently that they're doing the work to understand what happened there. They're discovering mass graves and skeletal remains within the walls of the prison. And in other countries you saw it occurred sooner, that these places of extreme suffering, the headquarters or the political prison of secret police forces in these countries, would be turned into memorials to educate future generations about what occurred. The fact that this is undone in so many places of Central and Eastern Europe, very recently in Albania, it was at the very top of political conversations what to do with the archives from the communist era there. And so I think there's absolutely work to be done in Central and Eastern Europe, but because of the history, I think Central and Eastern Europe play an important role in educating Western Europeans and Americans about that history, because we certainly need to learn what happened, and we need to inoculate future generations in the United States and elsewhere from succumbing to the very seductive ideas of Marxism.
As a matter of fact, at the time of 1991 and later, the number of mass graves, some containing as many as 100,000 people in the Soviet Union, sometimes near Moscow, but across the Soviet Union, was something that was not very extensively covered in the Western media. I thought that extremely significant because it was almost as if people in the West, and I don't mean here the people who sympathize with communism, but they didn't really want to face up to the terrible reality of what had happened in those years. And in a sense, in addition to many of the other points you've raised about why we continue to, in a sense, not regard communism as a massive set of crimes, in addition to that, the one reason is that we fundamentally don't want to face up to how terrible it was, because we not only didn't stop it, that might not have been possible, we didn't really express anything like the right level at the time of indignation, horror, and fundamentally, serious moral protest.
Absolutely. I mean, the West, and unfortunately Western intellectuals, as you say, have been complicit in the ideas of Marxism and communism, of course, but also in their ability to take root practically. So, of course, Marx and Engels were about as privileged and Western as they come in the 1800s, and they provided a coherent framework for socialism, and in that sense, Marxism sort of won the competition of ideas within what were a pretty broad array of socialist movements in the late 19th century. And of course, that was the intellectual side, but ideas do have consequences. And you saw Germany. In World War I, both, but also before and certainly after, the German government supported the Bolshevik movement in Russia as a way to destabilize the Tsarist regime. After the February Revolution in Russia, the German government sent Lenin back to Russia, and also other Bolshevik leaders, of course wanting Russia to withdraw from World War I. But the Russian government, even after World War I, helped to stabilize the Soviet economy. The United States purchased grain from Russia, even as the Holodomor was taking place, the man-made famine that Stalin implemented as policy against the ethnic Ukrainians. You had Walter Duranty, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist for the New York Times, who essentially copied and pasted Soviet propaganda about the Holodomor famine taking place. So from then until now, you have absolutely an apologia for Marxism as an intellectual idea, but also an explanation and a sweeping under the rug of the crimes of communist regimes at America's top universities, at America's major newspapers. And certainly if you were to apply the same standard that we have all applied to the crimes of Nazism, and apply that to the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China or Castro's Cuba, I think we could all make some progress in learning basic lessons from the 20th century. But that's not yet been done. There is a double standard.
As a matter of fact, I agree with that. At the same time, there was, so to speak, this very strong official and intellectual support and a deliberate turning of the blind eye to what communist regimes were like. There was a small, but in the end quite influential series of able, honest and decent historians. And journalists. I'm beginning with, for example, Malcolm Muggeridge, the Guardian journalist in Moscow, who went to the Soviet Union as a Guardian reporter intending to become a Soviet citizen. Fortunately for him, he saw the reality in time, and when he came out, he told the truth. You have Robert Conquest, the great Sovietologist. So you have these people, and some of them were associated with the Victims of Communism Foundation. So I want to ask you now about the work when did it start, what it does, how is it doing?
Well, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation was established due to an authorizing act by the U.S. Congress in 1993. You had especially conservative Republican senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms, and liberal Democrat from California, Congressman Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor to serve in the U.S. Congress. And they inserted language into an act dealing with trade and other matters with Russia at the time, sort of necessary work that needed to be done following the end of the Cold War. And they inserted language calling for an organization to be established that would educate Americans about the ideology, the history, and the legacy of communism. And we had the co-founders of our foundation, Lev Dobryansky, Lee Edwards, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who established the foundation in 2007. We had President George W. Bush, who dedicated the first memorial in the world in honor of every single victim of a communist regime, from Cuba to China to Poland and elsewhere. And now we are working on establishing a museum in Washington, D.C., and phase one of that museum will open in spring of next year, 2021. And beyond that, we conduct a number of programs in the U.S., educational initiatives in all 50 states, memorial events in all 50 states. We support, as I mentioned, on the human rights front, both with lawmakers and the general public, a greater awareness about what is happening in China, North Korea, Laos, Vietnam, Venezuela, Cuba. And we have sort of citizen education campaigns which try to raise these issues in public debate, which is, of course, very important when you have, as I mentioned, a sort of high watermark in the United States of socialism, Marxist ideas, and even fascist ideas. To see hammer and sickle flags, swastikas on American streets, ongoing violence. It reminds you in certain cities of scenes in the Weimar Republic in Germany, and this is certainly not a story we want to repeat.
Yes. What about the educational initiatives? Because obviously they're very much needed if so many young people believe that communism is fundamentally a decent system and have no knowledge of its crimes.
I've been very encouraged that we simply can't even keep up with demand in terms of public, private, and other schools who would like to use our curriculum supplements in the classroom. We have educator seminars in Washington, D.C. and around the country, and for middle school and high school teachers. And we have a speakers bureau for college campuses where we'll send a survivor of a communist country or experts, historians, economists to talk about whatever issue they're interested in. And so I think there is a desire. Teachers go into the profession because I believe they love their students and really do want to educate them. And certainly if we can't convey some of the hardest learned lessons of the last century to a new generation and avoid repeating those mistakes, then education at a very fundamental level from a public perspective has failed. And so I would say that our educational initiatives have been welcomed in schools around the country, and we're ramping up those initiatives.
When you say they've been welcomed, I'm slightly surprised because we live in the world of cancel culture in which speakers are not only shouted down, they're not allowed to come into the building in the first place. So how are your speakers received?
So it obviously varies. I would say that what I said is true for individual teachers and those who go into the profession because they love their students. There, as you well know, are another set of people who go into education as a field. And these would be the administrators and those who have a much more ideological view of education. And sometimes, yes, it's true in terms of designing curricula or other things. Right now we're dealing with a situation in California that would institute sort of critical race theory as a core element of understanding U.S. history. This is always an ongoing sort of policy effort. But in terms of putting curriculum resources in the hands of teachers, inviting them to participate in our continuing education seminars that occur throughout the United States, as I said, we have been welcomed and are struggling to keep up with demand. And so, that's very hopeful. And I am quite confident that this can be reversed. The poll that I mentioned that we conduct every year asks a question. Who do you most trust to look after your interest? Yourself, your community, or the government? And last year was the first time we asked the question, and it was an overwhelming majority chose either themselves or their community. The government, of course, was a distant last. And this year, it was an even greater percentage trust themselves or their community. And I think there are lots of reasons for that, COVID and other mismanagement of public policy matters. But I think the fundamentals are there. I think if there is an honest assessment of the history by those we trust to educate our children, and if there is an honest debate by the media and lawmakers about what is happening in China and Cuba and Russia and other countries today, I do think we're going to have a better 21st century, but it's going to take some work.
Now, in terms of enlightenment, in terms of enlightening people, in terms of education, in terms of what the communists called agitprop, shouldn't we, somewhere or other, have a trial of communism, a Nuremberg trial of communism, or to soften it slightly, something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that occurred after the changes in Chile and South Africa, because that might be something you should do or something somebody should do, perhaps governments. What's your view on what might be done?
Well, it is something that many people have called for. You mentioned Vladimir Bukovsky. Yes, before he died, this was an effort he was working on. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of being a juror on a tribunal in Cottbus, Germany, Cottbus being the site of a very large a prison in which you had a very large number of political prisoners during the GDR regime. And the prison itself had been purchased by former prisoners after unification. And this tribunal was hearing testimony of former forced labor political prisoners in that prison and other prisons. And those proceedings were used in the Bundestag subsequently as part of an ongoing conversation about even reparations for those who suffered in that way under the GDR. There was an initiative led by Lithuania a few years ago to hold former Soviet authorities responsible for certain crimes conducted against or committed against Lithuanians. There are a number of these efforts. I think it's very important to have a moral reckoning. I think the legal reckoning, of course, has to be country by country. But I do think it is unacceptable to have judges who participated in sentencing political prisoners prior to 1989 continue to serve in the judicial profession in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And this has happened. It remains in some countries a problem. And former high-ranking communist officials who participated in that regime, they can do lots of things, but they shouldn't be exercising political or judicial power in these now democratic countries.
Well, I agree with that. Let me, however, ask that what kind of support are you getting here from governments? Because in the light of what you've been saying, it seems that for moral reasons, for practical political reasons, for the sake of, so to speak, political hygiene and decency, there should be enormous support from, I'd say, governments and from private citizens, from foundations, for the work you're doing. Are you getting that?
Yes, so I would say in terms of our museum project, the government of Hungary has very generously supported that project in Washington, D.C. The government of Poland has very generously supported it. Other countries, other governments are going to support it, and details on that will be forthcoming. Ultimately, private American citizens are going to be the main financial backing for the museum project, and that's already the case. But it is, I think, very important that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe are helping this project become a reality in Washington, D.C., that will tell a very important piece of their story that is, frankly, unknown by most Americans, but very much integral to the friendship that we have diplomatically, integral to our continued civilization and a political future of freedom and free enterprise, human rights. And so I think it's a very important project, and it's wonderful that these countries are supporting it so robustly.
I didn't hear the names Britain, France, Italy, Germany in your list. I mean, are they there?
Well, I'm very happy to say that Germany has very recently become a real ally on this as well. You mentioned, but of course Germany has at least half the country, a significant portion of the country in the GDR, a history of a communist past. I think with France, the Netherlands, Britain, Spain, it's certainly a harder sell, and we cooperate with these countries in some of our memorial events in Washington, D.C., but remains to be seen whether or not there would be support for this project. But again, I think if we understand the Cold War and also our continuing confrontation with Communist China and a recalcitrant Putin's Russia and other countries who have a very different vision of what the 21st century would look like. If we understood the Cold War and the current confrontation in terms of this civilizational story, I think we would all see the benefit in learning that the two great threats, intellectually and materially, to our civilization, to freedom in the last century, were fascism, Nazism, and communism, national socialism and international socialism. And if we can understand that and get our narrative straight on that, I think it would provide a tremendous sense of optimism and confidence in confronting a very confident communist China. But also we could learn how to do some things that we did well, and we could learn from some tactics and other policies that we got wrong. Because certainly I don't think, I'm not willing to accept that communist Cuba is forever going to exist. I'm not willing to accept that Beijing will simply absorb Taiwan in the way that they have absorbed Hong Kong, both, of course, in violation of international treaties. I'm not willing to accept that. And so I think we must look at the success and failure of the last century to get ready to steel ourselves for the confrontation that is already underway.
What about the churches? Obviously the Christian churches, they would seem that they would be most invested in some of the ideas you've been talking about, particularly the educational ideas, because they, after all, defend freedom of religion, among other things. But we shouldn't confine ourselves to the Christian churches. What about Islam? What about other religions in the world? But it's fair to say that Islam and Christianity are, in a sense, the two most powerful religions at the present time.
Yeah. Well, our foundation, we work with Tibetan Buddhists, we work with Uyghur Muslims, we work with house Christians, we work with Catholic, we work with Mormon groups. So all of these, Falun Gong and others, all of these groups are threatened by a system that denies the human need for spirituality. And certainly communism was the world's first atheistic political movement and regime. And that's why even today in Xinjiang or Tibet or elsewhere in China, you have a campaign to eradicate religion. So under Xi Jinping, a campaign really not seen in this intensity since Mao, to re-educate populations in camps and through other means, an online peer credit system, but to force people to abandon religious affiliation and to accept the party as the highest moral authority in society. So it's not that there's no moral code, it's that there is an ethical code that is in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party and that, shores up their stranglehold on power. This is explained in the re-education, seminars in Marxist and Maoist ideology. So, you have people who say that China is not communist today, and that would be a statement completely ignoring the facts of how the Chinese Communist Party is seeking to remold the minds of young Chinese people, Uyghur people, Tibetan, and elsewhere.
Yes, I completely agree with that. What's interesting is that it has managed to shed, so communism has managed, particularly in the Chinese version, to shed the economic failures of the past, even though they caused the deaths of millions. I mean, in the case of Mao, for example, who still retains tremendous cult status within communist China, I mean, his great leap forward and his cultural revolution, they cost tens of millions of lives, and yet we seem to have forgotten them. I have two other churches I want you to discuss. Well, one is one of the Christian churches. What role does communism at the moment play a sufficient role in what the Catholic Church is saying, particularly what the current Pope is saying? And secondly, what about the Church of Atheism? Because there are a number, there's a growing support for atheism in Western Europe and the United States. Probably in Western Europe it's the default religion, really. And yet at the same time you have distinguished intellectuals who are atheists, like John Gray, for example, who are anything but pro-communist. They're fiercely anti-communist. And yet, have you been able to make, so to speak, as an organization, any dent in the Church of Atheism and as I say, in the Vatican?
Well, on your last question first, I would say that freedom of conscience, of course, should be protected, and in a free society it is. And so really in what we have seen in more than 100 years of communist parties in power is that, even socialist, even Marxist, right, if you have the wrong interpretation of Marx and you run afoul practically of the leadership, then you're a target as well. Some of the very first purged in Russia in the Bolshevik Revolution were socialists, were even Bolsheviks who had a different interpretation of what should happen next. And so, certainly we work with all groups who would defend freedom of conscience as a fundamental human right that must be respected by governments everywhere. From my own perspective, I would say that fundamental human right is there because we were all created equally. And in my Christian interpretation, that highest moral authority comes from God, and we, all equal as His creation, have no right to infringe upon the freedoms or the dignity of our fellow human. And I think that is the framework upon which the entire conversation about human rights has taken place. Certainly it was subverted by the Soviets and other Marxists during debates over the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which an awful lot of positive rights were added to what we now understand as human rights. But of course, in many cases, that is a demand on someone else's, an impingement on someone else's rights to make them a reality. On your first question about the Vatican and their recent dealings with the Chinese Communist Party, I have to tell you that this has been a tremendous disappointment for all of the Chinese Catholics that I have spoken to in China. And you have Cardinal Zen, eminent leader in Hong Kong, who has been, I think, the most vocal critic of what the Vatican has done. And he has even said he would not like to be buried in the same edifice with some of the future cardinals or bishops who may be appointed with the cooperation and the veto power of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think from a comparative perspective, if you look at the role that Pope John Paul II played and the role that the current Pope is playing on this question of religious freedom, freedom of conscience, and the role of the Chinese Communist Party in trying to control what has been an element in Chinese society. Christianity is, rapidly growing. There are, by many estimates, more Christians in China than there are in all of Europe. And the party cannot control them, and this is an effort to control the official Catholic Church in China. So I think it's a huge disappointment to many people who are covering the issue. It's certainly a disappointment for those I know in China who view this as a sellout.
Well, it's quite a statement for Cardinal Zen to say that he wouldn't be seen dead with some of his fellow bishops appointed via the with a communist approval. I'd like to turn to the cinema, and to media more generally, and to Hollywood. We think of Hollywood as being a redoubt of extreme liberalism, and that has carried with it some sympathy for communism in films like Reds and other films. But there have been two or three really interesting and valuable and artistically good movies on communism. One is, I think, the movie Mr. Jones, which is, of course, Mr. Jones being Gareth Jones, the Welsh reporter who told the truth about the crimes of communism, particularly the forced starvation in Ukraine, at a time when Walter Duranty was assuring the readers of the New York Times that everybody was getting at least 2.5 square meals a day. So do you see any movement in Hollywood and in the larger cinema culture, movie culture, towards covering this biggest of all stories of the 20th century, which is devoted scandalously little time to? And what are you doing to try to encourage that interest?
Yes. Well, I would say that there is an uptick in the number of films that have been produced or under production that deal with this very important history, as you say. And you mentioned Mr. Jones. There's also Ashes in the Snow. There is Bitter Harvest. There are a number of movies that are telling important parts of the history in Ukraine, Russia, the Baltics. You have also in Hungary and other countries in the region their own national language films that are doing, in many cases, a wonderful job of telling this history. I do think if you look at the disparity between the number of films made about the Nazis and those made about Soviet and other communist regimes, it can't even be compared. And yet the history there, as you mentioned, more than 100 years, some 40 nations that have experienced communist rule, and the number of stories, the heroes, the villains, the human suffering, the heroism. I mean, it really is a wealth of human interest and stories to tell. And so, yes, I mean, filmmaking and popular media is, like it or not, one of the main ways that especially younger generations understand the world, understand our past, understand history. And so it certainly has to be an element of our work. We have supported a number of documentary projects. We have a project called Witness that interviews and tells the stories of survivors of communist regimes. That can be found on our website. And we're looking at other ways to engage in popular culture more generally. But Hollywood, sports, the NBA, corporate America has certainly engaged in a double standard. Critiquing American society and culture and average Americans, based on the social fad of the day, while at the same time investing heavily in the success and the future of the Chinese Communist Party or other dictatorial regimes, and in some cases utilizing modern-day slave labor, forced labor, in their supply chains. And so I do think that it is incumbent upon American lawmakers and the American public, and also it would be true for countries and populations in this part of the world, to demand that their governments, their companies, not be complicit in this activity. In the case of the United States, of course, it is increasingly understood that the slave labor that China engages in not only hurts individuals in China, but is one of the reasons why average factory workers in Middle America and elsewhere have been made unemployed. And so, speaking truth to China, addressing the human rights issues, understanding also that you cannot have free trade between a market economy and a slave state. All right? All of these things are part and parcel of a realignment and normalization, if you will, a more commonsensical approach, a more principled approach. to U.S. Relations with China.
Well, I think you're going to make a good deal of ground with your argument there, whatever the result of the election, because there is now a growing realization across the spectrum, including corporate America, I think, though perhaps not as strongly as I would wish, that China can't be just treated as another country and another trading partner. There has to be a serious, and our trade and relations have to be based on a serious moral and strategic analysis of what China threatens in our lives. I want to go back to a final question, which takes us also back to the beginning of our conversation. At the moment, we are witnessing an extraordinary upsurge of energy and anarchy on the American left. We see a number of factors in combination. One of them is, for example, that in local authorities controlled by some left Democrats, they no longer enforce the law equally. I mean, they enforce it against violence from the right, which there hasn't been a great deal actually, and they tend to turn a blind eye to violence from the left. I think that's a very dangerous thing, and it encourages disorder throughout the society. But let's just examine what they think they are doing. I mean, obviously, communism, in the sense of the Communist Party, plays probably a small part in this, but it plays a part. What are the other elements that combine with it, and how can we, in fact, analyze the situation that's going? How would you analyze the situation so as to provide the rest of us with a roadmap to dealing with it effectively?
I think what's played out on American streets in the last few months reveals an unprecedented lack of confidence in America, in who we are, in our civilization. And that has been demonstrated by the unprecedented degree to which elected officials have allowed mobs to destroy lives and livelihoods on American streets. It's not all cities, of course, but it is more than a dozen, where elected mayors, city councils, governors in some cases, have refused to enforce the rule of law. And, seemingly unconcerned with the fact that in the name of social justice or Black Lives Matter, it's the homes and the small businesses of Black business owners and other minorities. It's their livelihoods that are being destroyed by this lawless behavior. And so ultimately what is happening on American streets right now is not about race, it's about power. And I think Americans have really come around to that understanding very recently. And of course, as a political matter, it's uncertain how it will play out in the election. But yes, I do think that this reveals a stunning lack of confidence in our way of life. And I do think that understanding the history of communism, I do think that understanding the way in which societies are destabilized, the way in which violent radical groups take advantage of opportunities, voids of leadership to break societies. I think all of that needs to be understood. And certainly the chaos occurring in some American cities and some American states is in the interest of Beijing, of Moscow, and other governments who do not want the United States, the free countries of the world, to gain ground or define this century.
I think this is a good point in which to end, although one might just add to it the thought that the present upheavals and the present semi-revolutionary outbursts are comparatively little to do with race, in the sense that Black America has been very unsympathetic historically to the attempts of the Communist Party to take up its cause, partly because, of course, most Black Americans are Christians, and probably more devout Christians than most of the whites, but also because Black America has been engaged in what is fundamentally, I'd call a liberal, old-fashioned liberal drive for equality with the rest of America and for opportunity. Whereas, of course, riot and left-wing demolition of neighborhoods, it's probably too strong maybe, is something that is inimical to the prospects of people who are trying to rise in the world, both collectively and individually. And I think we are now seeing that the Antifa and BLM is fundamentally not a racial group. It is in fact a left group, which many of the most prominent people, many of the most active people are white. And I think this is, we need to look at this more frequently. I think I'll probably cut all that, that last bit. But so I'll probably go to say.
It was very good, though. I mean, it's of course true. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
But Marion, thank you very much for coming in. Thank you for explaining what you're doing so well and I think so effectively. And I think I'd like to tell our viewers that this is a very good cause, because it's a cause which brings together, on the one hand, liberalism and equality and all those good things, and secondly, historical truth. And what is the opposite to communism? I think you defined it before. The opposite to communism is freedom of conscience, because freedom of conscience produces a lot of different actions in the human person. And the fact that you, for example, were homeschooled, I thought is probably quite significant. I believe that homeschooled people, by and large, are more likely to exhibit independent opinions than people who've gone through what, in the cases of countries like Sweden, is an increasingly rigorous indoctrination in a set of semi-socialist ideas. So we really need to pay attention to how we educate people. But I want to thank you, and welcome, and we'd like to see you again. Well, why don't we keep a steady debate with you so we find out more and more of what you're doing and how well you're succeeding?
Sounds good to me, John.
Good. Thanks.
Thank you.